He hadn't set foot on that land in 18 years. Not since the night his father died under circumstances no one dared to question. Returned to the forgotten farm with only his husky by his side, he found the front door unlocked, the tractor still warm, and a letter on the table written to him by a man who'd been dead for 2 decades. What happened next didn't just break his heart. Changed the course of his life, forever. Late autumn had settled over the borderlands between Oregon and Washington, the kind of season when the sky carried a thin, metallic chill, and the pine-covered ridges rose like dark, ancient sentinels above the valleys, their shadows stretching long over the yellow grass. The mountains felt both lonely and timeless, a place where a man could lose himself completely, or find the pieces he thought were gone forever. Caleb Rourke, now 38, stood at the crest of the dirt road leading into Aspen Ridge, boots coated in dust, breath faintly visible in the morning air. He looked every bit the mountain man he had become in the years since he fled this place. Broad-shouldered, weather-lined from sun and wind, brown beard flecked with early gray, eyes sharp like someone who had learned long ago not to trust silence unless he understood what was hiding inside it. His leather jacket, worn at the edges, carried the smell of smoke and forest pine. The denim shirt beneath it was faded from years of hard travel. A canvas backpack hung on his shoulders, patched in places, each stitch holding some memory of the roads he had walked. At his side moved Hawk, the loyal husky who had followed him through storms, long winters, and the kind of loneliness that only a man who lived too long with regret could understand. Hawk was 5 years old, with a thick coat of silver and white, amber eyes bright with vigilance, tail curled but steady. He walked with the poised confidence of an animal who trusted his instincts more than the world around him. The dog's breath billowed in small puffs as he sniffed the air, ears flicking at sounds Caleb couldn't hear. Together, man and dog stared at the old house standing at the center of the clearing. A 2-story wooden structure with paint long faded to a tired gray, its porch sagging, its windows dark except where the sun caught broken glass and scattered it in quiet shards. Beside the house sat a red barn whose roof leaned slightly, as though tired of holding secrets. A rusted tractor rested in the tall grass like a skeleton from another life, its gears stiff, its wheels half sunk into the earth. And around it all, the familiar scent of drying hay and cool forest wind wrapped around Caleb like a memory he didn't ask for, but could never shake. 18 years. It had been that long since he last stood here. 18 years since the night his father died, leaving behind more questions than answers, and a son who couldn't bear the weight of a grief he didn't know how to carry. Caleb had left Aspen Ridge at 19, swearing he'd never return. But time had a strange way of calling a man back to the places that wounded him most. Mountain people called it the home pull, the invisible thread between a man and the land that shaped him. And standing there, Caleb felt that thread tugging hard at his chest. He stepped toward the porch, boots creaking on boards softened by rain and years. Hawk trotted beside him, muzzle low, tail stiff in a way that made Caleb's nerves tighten. When Caleb reached for the door, his hand paused. It was unlocked. That door had been locked the night he left. He remembered turning the key himself, as if closing it would seal away the pain. Now it swung inward with the slightest push, revealing a kitchen cloaked in dust except for one detail. On the table sat a chipped enamel mug, its rim broken and its interior showing a faint, recent ring, like someone had used it not long ago. The air carried a scent of cold metal and something else, something disturbed. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured, sensing Hawk tense beside him. The husky lowered his head, nose brushing the floorboards, a low growl rumbling from deep in his chest. His amber eyes met Caleb's, warning shimmering in them. Caleb's pulse quickened. He moved through the house slowly, each step stirring echoes of childhood. The place where his father repaired boots near the window, the worn spot on the banister where Caleb used to slide his hand during summers that felt endless. Yet under the nostalgia lurked a strange presence, like someone had walked through his memories and rearranged them. When he climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, Hawk stayed close behind, nails clicking lightly on the wood. The attic smelled of dust and cedar, and morning light cut through gaps in the roof. Caleb's boot brushed against something metallic, half hidden beneath an old tarp. He knelt and pulled out a weather-worn tin box, the kind his father once used to store maps and receipts. Its latch clicked open easily. Inside lay a sealed envelope, yellowed but unbroken. On its front, written in a steady, deliberate hand, were the words, "For the last one who remembers this place." Caleb felt a cold ripple move through him, as though the voice of a ghost had reached him across time. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside were hand-drawn sketches of areas around Aspen Ridge, circles marking places he had played as a boy, shaded lines pointing to parts of the forest he had never been allowed to explore. At the bottom of the last page, in smaller handwriting, was a single message. "Don't let them take this land. They're coming back." No date, no signature, nothing to say who the "they" were. Yet Caleb already felt a familiar dread crawling up from some buried place in his chest. The afternoon passed slowly, the sun slipping behind clouds as though retreating from the land's uneasy silence. When the rumble of an engine echoed down the dirt road, Caleb stiffened. Hawk's ears pricked. A small pickup truck approached, dust swirling behind it. A woman stepped out, mid-30s, with long brown hair tucked into a worn baseball cap, jacket zipped up against the growing cold. Her posture carried a mix of confidence and caution, like someone used to walking uninvited onto properties that needed checking. "You must be the new arrival," she said, voice steady but holding an undertone Caleb couldn't read. "I'm Emma Caldwell, Land Conservation Officer from Winter Creek." She offered a half-smile, polite but guarded. Caleb studied her the way mountain men do, with patience, noting the faint smudges of ink on her fingers, the slight tension around her eyes, the way she glanced at the house with something more than professional concern. "Saw smoke earlier," Emma continued. "Wanted to make sure no trespassers were causing trouble." But when Caleb mentioned the house's previous owner, her gaze flickered away, the hesitation brief but unmistakable. She knew something, maybe too much, and yet chose silence. Hawk, usually distant with strangers, wagged his tail at her, a small gesture, but enough to unsettle Caleb further. Evening came quickly, shadows lengthening until they swallowed the yard. After Emma left, her truck's headlights disappearing down the road, Caleb felt the weight of the land pressing in around him. He took Hawk and circled the property, letting the dog lead where his instincts pulled. Behind the old barn, the earth was disturbed. Caleb crouched. Fresh tire tracks marred the dirt. Footprints, not his, cut through the grass. And half buried beneath a tangle of weeds lay a sleek, expensive flashlight, far newer than anything that belonged on a forgotten farm. Someone else had been here, recently, secretly. Caleb felt the familiar steel of his father's compass beneath his shirt and gripped it tightly, grounding himself against the rising storm of unease. Hawk let out a low, deliberate bark, staring toward the tree line where moonlight barely touched the forest floor, as if something or someone waited just beyond sight. And in that moment, Caleb knew one truth with the clarity of mountain wind. Something had awakened the moment he stepped onto this land. and whatever had been quiet for 18 years was no longer willing to stay buried. Morning came thin and pale over Aspen Ridge, the sky a washed-out blue that carried the promise of cold later in the day. Mist hung low across the grass, curling around the old fence posts and the rusted tractor like a memory that refused to lift. Caleb stepped out into it with Hawk padding at his heel, the envelope from the attic folded in his pocket, the maps inside already etched into his mind. The air smelled of damp earth and pine resin, and somewhere, far up on the ridge, a hawk cried, its call stretching over the valley. Caleb followed the directions marked on those careful sketches, counting his steps from the back porch, measuring distance the way his father had once taught him, by stride, by landmark, by the feel of the land beneath his boots. The path took him behind the leaning barn where the ground dipped slightly, to a patch of soil his younger self had always been warned away from with gruff words and no explanation. Now he knew why. Beneath a crust of weeds and old boards, he found the outline of a square set into the earth. The metal hatch there had once been painted red. Now, most of the color had bled away, but the heavy lock that had guarded it was a twisted ruin, its shackle sheared clean. Someone had forced it open long before he came home. Hawk sniffed the edge, hackles raised just enough to let Caleb know he was catching old scent. Human, not animal. Caleb forced the hatch up, hinges groaning, and a breath of cold, stale air rolled out, smelling of metal and stone and time. He climbed down the narrow steps with the Husky waiting anxiously at the top, the dog's nails scritching against the hatch frame as if arguing with gravity. The room below was small, carved directly into the packed earth beneath the barn. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, dead and useless, but enough light filtered down the steps for Caleb's eyes to adjust. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with equipment his father had never spoken of. A rugged, boxy device he recognized as a field seismograph from his time working on remote construction crews, a portable core sampler leaning in a corner, and neatly rolled maps held in leather tubes like something out of another century. He picked one at random, unfastened the strap, and let the paper unfurl against an old workbench. The map wasn't of roads or property lines. It was the bone-deep layout of the land itself. Layers of rock, fault lines, shaded pockets where something had been highlighted with precise, obsessive care. Mineral concentrations were marked in tight handwriting. Beside one cluster of symbols, a note had been scribbled in a hand he recognized from old grocery lists and fence repair notes. Rare earth deposits, substantial. Do not let Iron North take this. Caleb's jaw tensed. Iron North. Even the name sounded like a threat. Years ago, they had come around with contracts and easy smiles, promising his father money enough to rebuild everything, to put the Rourke name back on, more than just a mailbox. His father had refused, saying the land had already paid for itself in sweat and memory, and no company was going to dig its heart out from under them. Months later, his father had gone out hunting and never come back, found at the base of a ravine with a shattered neck and a report that said, "Accidental fall," in clean, impersonal letters. Caleb had never truly believed it, not deep down. Now, standing in a hidden room full of geological instruments and battle plans he'd never known existed, that disbelief hardened into something sharper. He traced the name Iron North with his finger, feeling the paper rough against his calloused skin, and understood that whatever his father had died for was tied to this dirt in ways no coroner's report could explain. When he climbed back into the light, Hawk bumped his leg with a soft whine, as if checking whether the man who came out was the same one who'd gone in. Caleb scratched behind the dog's ears, more grateful for the touch than he would have admitted. The day stretched long after that, shadows moving slowly across the yard as he turned over memories and maps in his mind. He worked on small tasks just to keep his hands busy, clearing debris from the porch, checking the roof line, reheating coffee until it tasted like burnt pine. But his thoughts kept circling back to Iron North and the broken lock on the hatch. Whoever had been down there hadn't found everything. That truth hummed at the edge of his awareness like a low, constant note. Near evening, the crunch of tires on gravel woke Hawk from his doze by the stove. The dog sprang up, stance alert but not panicked. Caleb stepped onto the porch as a familiar pickup rolled into view, the fading light catching the dust on its windshield. Emma Caldwell climbed out, more slowly this time, as if the weight she carried had doubled since the day before. Her brown hair was still tucked beneath her cap, but there were dark smudges under her eyes, like she hadn't slept much. Her jacket hung open, revealing a flannel shirt buttoned crookedly, as if she'd dressed in a hurry. She walked up to the porch with her hands jammed into her pockets, gaze flicking between Caleb and the house before landing on the ground near his boots. "We need to talk," she said quietly. There was no practiced politeness in her voice now, only something raw. Inside, at the scarred kitchen table, the two of them sat facing each other while Hawk lay at Emma's feet, head on his paws like a silent witness. Emma's fingers clenched around a mug of coffee she barely touched. For a long moment, she stared at the steam curling up from it as if searching for the right words inside the swirl. "I wasn't honest with you yesterday," she began, eyes finally lifting to meet his. "Not completely." She told him then how a decade earlier she had worked not for the county or some gentle conservation group, but for Iron North itself, hired fresh out of college as a legal assistant with big dreams and not nearly enough questions. She described the corporate office in Portland with its glass walls and clean lines, the suits that smiled too much, the way they spoke of land as assets and families as obstacles. Her job had been simple at first, filing, drafting letters, organizing case folders, but eventually she'd been trusted with more. One night, staying late, she'd been asked to prepare documents connected to a remote property called Aspen Ridge. She hadn't known then that the name would anchor itself into her life. The files described rare earth minerals worth more than she could imagine, projections of profit, contingency plans if the owner refused to sell. There were memos suggesting pressure strategies for non-cooperative landholders. Some of the language was crossed out in pen, replaced with euphemisms, but the intent bled through every line. "Your father's name was on those papers," Emma whispered, knuckles white around the mug. "They talked about him like he was a problem to solve, not a man. I went to my supervisor, said I was uncomfortable. He told me I was getting too attached, that people like your father held progress hostage." She laughed once, a short, bitter sound. That same week, there was an internal email celebrating that a potential obstacle had been removed due to an unfortunate hunting accident. They didn't say his name, but I knew. She quit shortly after, she said, walked away from the salary and the city and the shiny promise of advancement, and remade herself slowly on the other side of the line, as a field officer for Winter Creek, the person who made sure land was treated like something living, not just a line item. But guilt, like the smell of coal dust on an old coat, never really washed out. As she spoke, tears burned tracks down her cheeks, and she turned her head as if ashamed to let him see. Hawk lifted his head then and nudged her knee, as if granting some quiet absolution. Caleb watched her, a storm of emotion rolling under his rough exterior. The anger was there, sharp, bitter, a taste he knew too well. But threaded through it was something else, something warmer he hadn't felt in years. The recognition of someone who'd also carried a burden too heavy, for too long. "You walked away," he said finally, voice low. "A lot of people wouldn't." Emma shook her head. "I walked away after the damage was done. That's not the same as bravery." "Maybe not," he replied, "but it's closer than staying." The air between them shifted, subtle as the change in wind before a storm. For the first time in a long while, Caleb felt the ice around his chest crack just a little. Whatever else Emma was, she was standing in his kitchen now, not in some glass tower, and that had to count for something. The moment fractured when Hawk suddenly sprang to his feet, a growl tearing from his throat that was deeper than anything Caleb had heard from him since winter wolves had come too close to their cabin years back. The Husky's gaze was locked on the window facing the tree line. Caleb was already rising from his chair when three figures emerged from the edge of the woods, dark silhouettes resolving into men in tailored jackets, the lines of their suits oddly formal against the wild backdrop. Their shoes, though, were built for rough ground, sturdy hiking soles beneath polished leather. They moved with the easy entitlement of people who believed they belonged wherever they chose to stand. Caleb stepped out onto the porch as they approached, Hawk at his side, muscles coiled. Emma hovered just behind him, shoulders squared despite the fear he could see tightening her jaw. The man in front was in his 40s, clean-shaven, with close-cropped hair gone silver at the temples, his expression smooth as river stone. His coat fit him like it had been tailored in a city far from here. He introduced himself with a name Caleb barely heard, announcing that he represented Iron North, his tone polite enough to make the word sound almost harmless. The two men flanking him were quieter, their gazes moving over the house and yard like surveyors measuring distance. The conversation that followed stretched taut between them like barbed wire. The spokesman outlined Iron North's interest in Aspen Ridge, describing their surveys, their intentions, their expectations that Caleb would be reasonable. He spoke of mineral rights and economic opportunity, of how complicated things could become if Caleb insisted on clinging to outdated claims. Caleb's reply was simple and unadorned. The land was his, the title clear, and he wasn't interested in selling so much as a single stone. Hawk didn't bark, but the growl never left him, a steady warning underscoring every word his handler spoke. Emma stepped out completely onto the porch then, standing at Caleb's shoulder. Her presence seemed to surprise the men. One of them narrowed his eyes in recognition, and a flicker of something, annoyance, crossed his face. She met their looks without flinching, the years of shame hardening now into a slim, bright blade. When the spokesman hinted that some assets truly belonged to Iron North, that Caleb was holding company property underground without authorization, she was the one who answered, voice steady as a judge's gavel, reminding them of trespassing laws, of private ownership, of the thin line between negotiation and intimidation. The man's smile thinned, friendliness peeling back to reveal steel. "You really think you can hold on to something your father couldn't?" he asked at last, eyes locked on Caleb's. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything Caleb had tried to rebuild inside himself. He didn't move, didn't blink, just let the silence stretch until the spokesman turned away, with a shrug that tried and failed to look casual. The three men returned to the trees, their dark shapes swallowed by the forest as quietly as they had appeared. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the pines and Hawk's slow, deliberate breathing as the growl finally eased from his chest. Later, with dusk pressing against the windows and a storm of thoughts crowding Caleb's mind, he and Emma went back to the hidden room under the barn. This time they searched more carefully, following the edges of the walls with their fingertips listening for hollows. In the farthest corner, where moss had crept down through some crack overhead, Emma's boot struck something that sounded different, a dull, contained thud. Together they cleared away the damp growth and loose stones to reveal a small safe, its metal body stained with age but still solid. The combination dial turned under Caleb's fingers with a reluctant grind, and he guessed at numbers that had mattered to his father: birthdays, anniversaries, the year the house had gone up. When the mechanism finally clicked, it did so with a softness that felt like a sigh. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, edges softened by handling, along with a thin stack of folded legal documents and a single photograph. Caleb lifted the picture first. It showed his father, younger and stronger, that familiar, crooked half-smile on his face, standing shoulder to shoulder with a woman whose features echoed in the shape of Emma's eyes and jawline. She wore her hair in the same wild brown waves, had the same determined tilt to her shoulders. Emma's breath hitched. "That's my mother," she whispered, fingers hovering over the image as if afraid it might vanish at her touch. Caleb opened the journal with hands that shook more than he wanted to admit. His father's handwriting marched across the pages, telling stories he'd never spoken aloud, about Iron North's offers and threats, about a quiet partnership with a woman named Laura Caldwell, about plans to protect Aspen Ridge from being gutted for profit. Near the back, in an entry written not long before the accident, a single line stood out, underlined twice. "If anything happens to me," it read, "trust Emma Caldwell. The girl has her mother's spine. She is not the enemy. She's the last good chance this place has." The words settled over the cellar like a benediction and a burden all at once. Caleb looked up at Emma, seeing now not just the woman in front of him, but the tangle of history that bound their families together. Two lives that had never crossed until now, stitched by a fight neither of them had started, but both had inherited. In the dim light of the hidden room, with Hawk resting at the top of the stairs like a guardian between worlds, they stood side by side, understanding that whatever came next would not be faced alone. In the end, Aspen Ridge reminded us of something we often forget in the noise of everyday life. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought in silence, and sometimes the strongest miracles come from the people standing quietly beside us. Caleb learned that the land he loved was never just soil and trees. It was memory. It was sacrifice. It was a promise handed down from the ones who came before him. And when all seemed lost, God sent help in the ways only He knows how. A loyal dog whose instincts never failed. A woman carrying her own scars yet brave enough to tell the truth. A hidden message left by a father who loved deeply. These were not accidents. They were the quiet fingerprints of a God who works through small moments, guiding us back to where we belong. And maybe that is the lesson for us too. In our own lives, when the road turns dark or the burden grows heavy, we must remember that God often moves through ordinary people and unexpected kindness. He sends strength when we are tired and light when we are unsure of the path. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who might need a reminder of hope. Leave a comment and tell us what part spoke to you the most, and subscribe so you never miss the next journey. May God bless you and everyone watching, and may He lead you gently through every valley and every mountain ahead.